The moment Terence Hawthorne's breathing stopped, his lawyer cleared his throat and announced the will would leave everything to the daughter he'd been forced to give up for adoption decades ago. I set down the morphine dispenser, thinking my 6 months of caring for this bitter old man were finally over. Then attorney James Mitchell looked directly at me and asked, "What is your full legal name? If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from." Now let me back up and tell you how I ended up in this surreal situation. 3 days earlier, I'd answered a classified ad for a live-in caregiver. At 62, with my husband dead and my savings drained by his medical bills, I was desperate for work. The Hawthorne mansion sat on 5 acres in Connecticut's wealthiest district, all stone walls and intimidating gates. "You're not what I expected," Terence had wheezed from his hospital bed when I first walked into his bedroom. His eyes were sharp despite his failing body, studying me like I was a puzzle to solve. "Most people aren't," I'd replied, adjusting his pillows. "That's what makes life interesting." He'd actually smiled at that, the first genuine expression I'd see from him for weeks. The job paid better than anything I'd ever earned, enough to finally get ahead instead of just surviving. But Terence Hawthorne was the most demanding patient I'd ever encountered. His housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, warned me the first week. "He's driven away 12 caregivers in 2 years. Don't take anything personally." But there was something about the way Terence looked at me sometimes, like he was seeing a ghost. And lately, his questions had become more personal, more probing. Yesterday, he'd asked about my childhood, my family, details that seemed unnecessary for a dying man and his employee. Now, staring at the lawyer in this mahogany-paneled study, I felt that familiar chill of dread I'd learned to trust over the years. Something wasn't right about this whole situation. "Margaret Collins," I answered carefully. "Why do you need to know?" Attorney Mitchell exchanged a meaningful glance with his assistant. "Because, Mrs. Collins, there's something Mr. Hawthorne discovered about you that changes everything." "What could Terence possibly have discovered about me?" I asked, though my hands were already shaking. In my experience, when lawyers start digging into your past, it never ends well for people like me. Attorney Mitchell opened a thick folder on the desk. "Mrs. Collins, were you born on March 15th, 1963? My blood turned to ice water. That date wasn't on any of my employment papers. I'd deliberately left it off applications my entire adult life. How did you—" "In Hartford General Hospital," he continued, reading from a document. "Birth mother listed as Jennifer Walsh, age 16, father unknown." The room started spinning. Nobody knew those details. My adoptive parents had died when I was 30, taking those secrets with them. I'd spent decades trying to forget that part of my story, building a new identity as Margaret Collins, wife and mother and caregiver. "I don't understand what this has to do with anything," I managed, though my voice sounded far away. Mitchell's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia, spoke up. "Mr. Hawthorne hired private investigators 6 months ago, the same day you started working here." 6 months ago. The day I'd walked into this house, desperate for work and a place to live. The day Terence had looked at me like he'd seen a ghost. Because maybe, in a way, he had. "He suspected something from your first interview," Mitchell continued. "Your facial structure, your mannerisms, certain responses to his questions, so he had you investigated." I thought about all those personal questions Terence had asked, about my childhood, my memories, my fears. I'd chalked it up to loneliness, an old man desperate for connection. But he'd been testing me, comparing my answers to information he already possessed. "What did he find?" I whispered. Mitchell pulled out a photograph, black and white and clearly decades old. It showed a young man with dark hair and intense eyes standing next to a girl who couldn't have been more than 16. She was pregnant, her belly round under a simple dress, her face filled with the kind of fear that comes from being in love with the wrong person at the wrong time. I'd never seen this photograph before, but I recognized the girl immediately. She had my eyes, my nose, my stubborn chin. She looked exactly like I had at that age, which was impossible because I'd never been pregnant as a teenager. "This is your birth mother, Jennifer Walsh," Mitchell said gently, "and this is Mr. Hawthorne, taken in 1962 when he was 18 years old." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Terence Hawthorne hadn't hired me by accident. He'd been looking for his daughter for over 60 years, And somehow I'd walked right into his house. But there was one problem with his theory. I wasn't his daughter. I couldn't be. "There's been a mistake," I said firmly, though my hands wouldn't stop trembling. My birth mother's name was Sarah Chen, not Jennifer Walsh, and she was 22, not 16. Attorney Mitchell and Patricia exchanged another one of those looks that made my stomach clench. They knew something I didn't, and in my experience, that never meant good news for the person left in the dark. "Mrs. Collins," Patricia said gently, "we understand this is overwhelming, but we have documentation that proves otherwise." She slid another folder across the desk toward me. Inside were copies of birth certificates, adoption papers, hospital records, documents I'd never seen before, but that apparently detailed my entire origin story. According to these records, Mitchell explained, Jennifer Walsh gave birth to a daughter on March 15, 1963. The baby was immediately placed for adoption through Catholic Charities. The adoptive family was Paul and Ellen Collins. My adoptive parents' names, the people who'd raised me, loved me, given me their last name and a stable home. But according to them, my birth mother had been a college student named Sarah who'd made one mistake and needed help getting back on track. My parents would never have lied to me about something this important, I insisted. But even as I said it, I could hear the doubt creeping into my voice. Adoption records were often modified to protect all parties involved, Patricia explained. It was common practice to change details, create new narratives that would be easier for adopted children to accept. I stared at the photograph of Jennifer Walsh and the young man who claimed to be Terrence Hawthorne. The resemblance was undeniable. The girl in the picture could have been my twin at that age. But if this was true, it meant everything I'd believed about my origins was a lie. "What happened to Jennifer?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. Mitchell's expression grew somber. "She died in a car accident 6 months after giving birth. She was driving to see the baby, to see you when it happened. Mr. Hawthorne spent the next 40 years searching for the daughter he'd never gotten to meet. A daughter who'd been raised by loving parents under a different name, with a completely different story about her beginnings. A daughter who'd grown up, married, raised children of her own, and never knew she was connected to one of the wealthiest families in Connecticut. If this is true," I said slowly, "if I really am his daughter, then why didn't he tell me? Why hire me as a caregiver instead of just introducing himself?" Patricia smiled sadly. "Because he was afraid you'd think he was just a crazy old man making up stories. He wanted to be sure, and he wanted you to get to know him as a person first, before the money and the inheritance complicated everything." I thought about the past 6 months, about Terrence's endless questions and intense stares, about how he'd insisted I call him by his first name instead of Mr. Hawthorne, about how he'd asked me to read to him every evening, always requesting the same type of stories, tales about families reuniting, about lost children finding their way home. He'd been trying to tell me the truth in his own way, leaving breadcrumbs for me to follow, but I'd been too focused on just surviving each day to see the pattern. "I need to see more proof," I said, though my voice was barely above a whisper. "This is all just, it's impossible." Mitchell nodded as if he'd expected this reaction. "Mr. Hawthorne anticipated your skepticism. He left detailed instructions for exactly this scenario. He opened another file, this one containing what appeared to be a handwritten letter. The paper was expensive stationery, the kind Terrence had always used for his personal correspondence. He wrote this 3 months ago," Mitchell explained, "after the investigators confirmed their findings. With shaking hands, I took the letter and began to read. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're finally learning the truth. I was too much of a coward to tell you while I was alive. You are my daughter, the child I've searched for every day since Jennifer died. I know this must be shocking, overwhelming, perhaps even unwelcome news. You've built a life as Margaret Collins, and that life has meaning and value completely separate from me. I don't want to take that away from you. But I also couldn't die without you knowing that you were wanted, that you were loved, that your birth was not a mistake to be hidden away. Jennifer loved you fiercely, even in the short time she carried you, and I have loved the idea of you every day for 62 years. I hired you not just because I needed care, but because I needed to know the woman my daughter had become. And Margaret, I could not be prouder. You are kind but not weak, strong but not cruel, intelligent without being pretentious. You are everything I hoped you would be, and things I never dared dream. I know you must have questions about why I gave you up, why I didn't fight harder to keep you. The truth is complicated and painful, but you deserve to know it all. The letter continued for 2 more pages, detailing the circumstances of his relationship with Jennifer, his family's pressure to give up the baby, his decades of regret and searching. It painted a picture of a young man torn between love and duty, who'd made a choice that haunted him for the rest of his life. But it was the final paragraph that made my hands shake so violently I could barely hold the paper. I've left you everything, Margaret. Not because I'm trying to buy your forgiveness or your love, but because it all belongs to you anyway. You are my heir, my legacy, my greatest treasure. Use it wisely. Use it well, and know that wherever I am now, I'm finally at peace knowing you're safe and loved. With all my love, your father, Terence. I set the letter down and stared at the wall behind Mitchell's desk. There hung a portrait of a young woman with dark hair and gentle eyes, Jennifer Walsh, my birth mother. The woman I'd never known existed until 30 minutes ago. How much? I asked quietly. I'm sorry? Mitchell looked confused. How much did he leave me? Mitchell consulted his papers. The estate is valued at approximately $47 million, plus the house, the art collection, the various business interests. In total, we're looking at roughly $63 million. I started laughing. Not the happy kind of laughter, but the hysterical kind that comes when reality becomes too absurd to process normally. Here I was, a woman who'd been struggling to pay rent just this morning, suddenly inheriting enough money to buy a small country. There's one more thing, Patricia said gently. Something Mr. Hawthorne wanted you to have immediately. Patricia reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small velvet jewelry box, the kind that's been passed down through generations and carries the weight of family history. He asked us to give you this first, before anything else, she said, placing it carefully in my hands. Inside was a delicate gold locket, clearly antique, but beautifully preserved. The front was engraved with the initials J.W., Jennifer Walsh. With trembling fingers, I opened it. On the left side was a tiny photograph of Jennifer, the same young woman from the earlier pictures, but this one showed her smiling, radiant, her hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly. On the right side was an even smaller photo, a baby, perhaps a few days old, sleeping peacefully in hospital blankets. Me. This was me as a newborn, the only picture my birth mother had been able to take before she gave me away. Jennifer wore this every day during her pregnancy, Mitchell explained quietly. Terence kept it all these years, hoping someday he'd be able to give it to you. I stared at the tiny face in the photograph, trying to reconcile this sleeping infant with the woman I'd become. For 62 years, I'd wondered what my birth parents looked like, whether I had their eyes or their smile or their stubborn streak. Now I knew I had my mother's eyes and my father's determination, and both of their capacity for keeping secrets. There's something else in the box, Patricia pointed out. I looked closer and found a small piece of paper, folded many times over to fit in the tiny space. Carefully, I unfolded it. In faded ink, written in a young woman's careful handwriting, were just a few words. For my baby girl, you are loved more than you will ever know. I'm sorry I can't keep you safe myself. Mama. The tears came then, fast and fierce. For the mother I'd never known, and the father I'd known too well without realizing who he was. For 62 years of wondering and 6 months of questions that finally had answers. Take your time, Mitchell said softly. This is a lot to process. I nodded, wiping my eyes with the tissue Patricia handed me. What happens now? With the will, I mean. Are there conditions? Things I have to do to inherit? No conditions whatsoever, Mitchell replied. Mr. Hawthorne was very specific about that. He said you'd earned your inheritance simply by being his daughter and by being the person you are. I thought about the past 6 months, about all the small moments that suddenly took on new meaning. The way Terence had insisted I eat dinner with him instead of just serving it and leaving. How he'd asked me to tell him stories about my life, my childhood, my late husband. How he'd seemed genuinely interested in my opinions about books, politics, world events. He hadn't just been hiring a caregiver, he'd been getting to know his daughter. Can I see the room where he... I paused, not sure how to phrase it. Where he died? Where my father spent his final moments? Of course, Mitchell said. The house is yours now. You can see any room you'd like. We walked through the mansion's grand hallways, past artwork that was probably worth more than most people's houses, up the curved staircase to the second floor. Terrence's bedroom was exactly as I'd left it, with the hospital bed and medical equipment that had been his world for the past year. But now I noticed things I'd missed before. On his nightstand was a small framed photo of Jennifer Walsh, positioned so he could see it from his bed. On the dresser was a stack of books about adoption reunion stories, and pinned to the bulletin board near his chair was a newspaper clipping about local caregiver services, the same ad I'd answered 6 months ago. He'd been planning this reunion for longer than I'd realized. Every detail had been carefully orchestrated to bring me into his life naturally, without the shock of immediate revelation. Standing in that room, surrounded by the accumulated wealth of a man I'd known as a difficult patient, but who'd actually been my father, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for all the years we'd lost, but relief that in the end, we'd found each other, even if I'd found out too late to tell him I understood. 3 hours later, I was sitting in what had been Terrence's private study, surrounded by lawyers, accountants, and estate managers, all of them explaining my new reality in terms that sounded like a foreign language. The liquid assets alone will require immediate attention, one man was saying. Treasury bonds, money market accounts, various investment portfolios. And then there's the real estate, another added. The Montana ranch, the Florida condo, the cabin in Vermont, plus this house, of course. I nodded along, trying to look like I understood what they were telling me. But honestly, I was still stuck on the fact that this morning I'd been Margaret Collins, widow and caregiver, and now I was Margaret Collins, secret heiress to a fortune I couldn't even comprehend. Mrs. Collins? Mitchell's voice broke through my thoughts. Do you have any questions about the inheritance process? Just one, I said. Why didn't he just tell me? If he was so sure I was his daughter, why go through all this elaborate charade? Mitchell smiled sadly. He was terrified you'd reject him. Think about it from his perspective. You'd lived your entire life believing your birth father had abandoned you. How do you approach someone with that kind of baggage and say, hello, I'm actually your father, and I've been looking for you for 40 years? I understood that fear. If some strange old man had approached me claiming to be my father, I probably would have assumed he was either crazy or running some kind of elaborate scam. He wanted you to know him first, Patricia added. To see that he wasn't a monster who'd thrown you away carelessly. He hoped that when you finally learned the truth, you'd have enough positive memories to balance out the anger. And the strange thing was, it was working. Yes, I was angry about the deception, frustrated by all the wasted time. But I was also remembering how Terrence had insisted on paying me double the advertised wage, how he'd made sure I had health insurance and vacation time, how he'd actually listened when I talked instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. He'd been trying to be the father he'd never gotten the chance to be. There's one more thing, Mitchell said, consulting his notes. Mr. Hawthorne left instructions for a specific bequest to someone he considered important to your story. He handed me another folder. Inside was a check made out to Catholic Charities for $2 million, along with a note, for the organization that kept my daughter safe when I couldn't. And for Paul and Ellen Collins, who loved her when I didn't know how to find her. Even in death, Terrence was trying to make amends for the choices that had separated us. He couldn't undo the past, but he could honor the people who'd filled the role he'd been unable to play. I looked around the study, at the built-in bookshelves filled with first editions, at the Persian rugs and crystal decanters, and all the trappings of old money. Tomorrow, I'd probably feel overwhelmed by the responsibility of managing all this wealth. But right now, I felt something else entirely. I felt like I was finally home. My phone buzzed with a text message from my neighbor back at the apartment complex. Haven't seen you in a few days. Everything okay? I stared at the message, thinking about how to respond. How do you explain that you've just discovered your entire life story was different than you thought? That you've gone from struggling to make rent to inheriting a fortune? That the difficult old man you'd been caring for was actually your father? Instead, I typed back, everything's fine, just some big changes happening. I'll call you soon. Big changes. That might be the understatement of the century. As the legal team packed up their papers and prepared to leave, Mitchell handed me a set of keys. "The house keys," he explained. "And the car keys. There's a BMW in the garage, fully paid off. Mr. Hawthorne wanted to make sure you had reliable transportation." I stared at the keys in my palm, feeling their weight. This morning I'd taken the bus to my job as a caregiver. Tonight, I was the owner of a mansion and a luxury car and more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. But more than that, I finally knew who I was and where I came from. And somehow, that knowledge was worth more than all the money in the world. As I walked through my father's house, my house, for the first time as its owner rather than an employee, I wondered what Jennifer Walsh would think of how this story had ended. Would she be proud that her daughter had grown up strong and independent? Would she be amazed at the reunion she'd never lived to see? I stopped in front of the portrait of her in the hallway, studying her young face and gentle smile. "I wish I could have met you," I whispered. "But thank you for giving me life, even when it cost you yours." Tomorrow would bring 100 new decisions, 1,000 details to sort through. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in my father's house, finally understanding the story that had brought me here. The next morning, I woke up in a bed that probably cost more than my annual salary at the nursing home where I'd worked before this. Egyptian cotton sheets, a mattress that felt like sleeping on a cloud, and windows that overlooked gardens I now apparently owned. For a moment I forgot where I was and reached for the alarm clock that wasn't there. Then reality crashed back. I was Margaret Collins, secret daughter of Terence Hawthorne, unexpected inheritor of a $63 million fortune, and I had absolutely no idea what I was supposed to do next. Mrs. Chen knocked softly on the door. "Miss Margaret, there are some people here to see you." People. That couldn't be good. I'd learned over the years that when people show up unannounced, they usually want something you're not prepared to give. I found 3 strangers in the living room, all of them wearing expensive suits and disappointed expressions. The woman leading the group had silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that could cut glass. "Miss Collins," she said, not bothering to stand. "I'm Victoria Hawthorne Pierce, Terence's niece. These are my brothers, Robert and William. Family." The family Terence had never mentioned in all our months together. Though given their expressions, I was starting to understand why. "We need to discuss this situation," Victoria continued. "This alleged inheritance." Alleged. I almost laughed. "I'm sorry, are you suggesting the DNA tests were wrong? That 3 different lawyers and a team of private investigators all made the same mistake?" Robert, a heavy-set man with Terence's nose but none of his intelligence behind his eyes, stepped forward. "We're suggesting that a convenient deathbed revelation shouldn't automatically entitle you to the family fortune. Especially," William added, "when there are legitimate family members who've been loyal to Terence their entire lives." I looked at these 3 people who shared Terence's DNA but apparently none of his character. "Loyal? Is that what you call showing up after he's dead to contest his will?" Victoria's smile was sharp as a knife. "We visited him regularly. We were here for every holiday, every birthday. Where were you for the first 62 years of his life? Learning to walk, graduating high school, raising my own children, and burying my husband," I replied sweetly. "You know, living the life he chose to give me by placing me for adoption." "This is exactly what we expected," Robert muttered. "Gold-digging attitude, no respect for family traditions." That's when I felt something shift inside me. Maybe it was genetics. Maybe it was finally having enough security to speak my mind. But suddenly, I was channeling every bit of Terence's sharp tongue and steely backbone. "Let me make something very clear," I said, standing up to face them. "I didn't ask for this inheritance. I didn't even know I was related to Terence until yesterday. But he chose to leave me his fortune, and he did it for his own reasons. If you have a problem with that decision, I suggest you take it up with him." "We intend to," Victoria said coldly. "In court." "They're bluffing," Attorney Mitchell assured me 3 days later. "The will is ironclad. The DNA evidence is conclusive, and Terence was clearly of sound mind when he made these decisions." I wasn't so sure. The Hawthorne siblings had hired their own legal team, and from what I'd gathered, they weren't the type to back down from a fight. They'd grown up expecting to inherit Terence's fortune, and the idea of some unknown, illegitimate daughter swooping in at the last minute had clearly shattered their life plans. "What's the worst-case scenario?" I asked. Mitchell hesitated. "If they can prove fraud or undue influence, if they can somehow argue that Terence was manipulated into changing his will, they could tie up the estate in court for years. Years. While these people with unlimited resources and inherited entitlement fought me for money I'd never asked for in the first place. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my whole life working for everything I had, and now I was being accused of being a gold digger. There's something else," Patricia added reluctantly. "We've discovered that Victoria has been managing some of Terence's business interests for the past 2 years, but only his commercial properties and investment portfolios. His personal affairs and household staff were kept completely separate. What kind of access? Limited power of attorney for business decisions only. Terence was very specific about maintaining control over his personal life. That explained how he'd been able to hire me without Victoria's knowledge. She'd been focused on the profitable side of his empire, while he maintained control over who entered his private world. That afternoon, while reviewing more legal documents, Mrs. Chen knocked on the study door. She looked nervous, wringing her hands in a way I'd never seen before. "Miss Margaret," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something important about Miss Victoria and what she knew." I gestured for her to sit down. "What about her?" "6 months ago, when you first started working here, Miss Victoria came to the house unexpectedly. She was angry because Mr. Terence had hired someone new without consulting her. Mrs. Chen's voice dropped to a whisper. "I overheard them arguing in this very room." My stomach dropped. "What did they argue about?" "Miss Victoria said she'd run a background check on you. She'd discovered who your birth parents were, and she was furious that Mr. Terence had brought his bastard daughter into the family home." The words hit me like a physical blow. Victoria had known all along who I was, but unlike Terence, she'd seen my identity as a threat rather than a gift. "Mr. Terence told her he didn't care what she thought," Mrs. Chen continued. "He said you were his employee and his decisions about household staff were none of her business. But Miss Victoria, she threatened him." "What kind of threat?" "She said if he told you the truth about your parentage, she'd have him declared mentally incompetent. She had copies of medical records from his chemotherapy treatments, documents that could be used to question his judgment." So Terence had been trapped between his desire to reveal our relationship and Victoria's threats. He'd found his daughter but couldn't claim her without risking everything. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" I asked. Mrs. Chen looked ashamed. "Miss Victoria paid me extra money to keep quiet. My grandson needed surgery and the money—" "I'm sorry, Miss Margaret. I should have been loyal to Mr. Terence, not to her." I understood desperation, the choices people make when they're cornered financially. "Mrs. Chen, would you be willing to testify about what you heard?" She nodded firmly. "Miss Victoria destroyed a good man's final months. He deserved to know his daughter openly, and you deserve to know your father. I won't let her steal that from either of you anymore." The court hearing was scheduled for the following month, which gave me just enough time to realize how in over my head I was. The Hawthorne siblings had hired Blackstone and Associates, one of Connecticut's most prestigious law firms. Their strategy, from what Mitchell could gather, was to paint me as a manipulative caregiver who'd taken advantage of a lonely, elderly man. "They're going to argue that you deliberately sought out this job, knowing who Terence was," Mitchell explained during one of our preparation sessions. "They'll claim you manipulated him into believing you were his daughter to secure an inheritance. But the DNA tests prove I am his daughter. DNA tests can be faked, according to their initial filing. They're also questioning the timing. Why did Terence only discover your identity after you'd been working for him for months? Why not immediately?" "Because he was afraid," I wanted to say. "Because he'd been disappointed so many times before. Because he wanted to know the woman I'd become before revealing the truth." But fear and hope weren't strong legal arguments. The worst part was the media attention. Somehow, the story had leaked to the local newspapers. Caregiver claims billionaire's fortune, and DNA or gold digging, the Hawthorne inheritance battle. Every time I left the house, there were photographers and reporters shouting questions about my scheme to defraud a grieving family. With Mrs. Chen's testimony about Victoria's threats and knowledge of my identity, Mitchell felt confident we could prove their case was fraudulent. But I wanted more than just to win. I wanted to understand exactly what Victoria had been doing to control Terrence's life. That's when I remembered the locked drawer in Terrence's desk that I'd noticed but never investigated. Using the key ring Mitchell had given me, I found one that fit. Inside were more letters, dozens of them, all addressed to various adoption agencies and private investigators. Letter after letter, year after year, asking for help finding his daughter. The earliest ones were formal, professional. The later ones grew increasingly desperate. But more importantly, there were financial documents showing unauthorized transfers from Terrence's personal accounts, medical records with notes in Victoria's handwriting, and most damning of all, a series of communications between Victoria and Terrence's doctors, where she'd specifically requested limitations on his pain medication and unnecessary treatments. One letter, dated just 3 weeks before his death, was in Terrence's handwriting. If anyone finds this, know that Victoria has been stealing from me for years. She convinced me to sign limited power of attorney papers when I was weak from chemotherapy, then exceeded that authority repeatedly. She's been controlling my medical care, moving my money, and threatening to have me declared incompetent if I contacted Margaret. I'm hiding these documents because Victoria searches my study regularly. She thinks I'm too sick to notice, but I see everything. Margaret, if you're reading this, use these papers to protect yourself and expose the truth. I should have been braver. I should have told you who you were the moment you walked into my life. But Victoria's threats terrified me. Not of losing my money, but of losing you before I'd gotten the chance to know the woman my daughter had become. You are everything I hoped for, and more than I deserved. Don't let them steal what belongs to you. All my love, Dad. The word Dad hit me like a physical blow. He'd known he was dying when he wrote this, and he'd used the one word I'd never gotten to say to him. Armed with Mrs. Chen's testimony and these documents, Mitchell and I prepared for a battle that was about more than inheritance. It was about justice for a man who'd spent his final months being controlled and threatened by the people who should have protected him. Victoria had underestimated 2 things: how much evidence Terrence had managed to hide, and how determined his daughter could be when fighting for someone she loved. The night before the court hearing, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Jennifer Walsh, about the young woman who'd given up her daughter to give her a better life, about Terrence, who'd spent over 60 years searching for that daughter and died just weeks after finding her, about the strange twist of fate that had brought me to his house as a caregiver when I could have walked into his life as his child decades earlier. I'd spent the past week reviewing all the evidence we'd gathered. Mrs. Chen's testimony about Victoria's knowledge and threats, the financial documents showing unauthorized transfers, the medical records proving Victoria had interfered with Terrence's treatment. It should have been enough to win our case, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria had one more card to play. At 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep and went to Terrence's study. I'd been spending a lot of time there lately, trying to understand the man who'd been my father. Tonight, I was drawn to the family photographs on his desk, pictures of the Hawthorne siblings as children, images of family gatherings and holiday celebrations. In every single photograph, Terrence looked like an outsider at his own family events. He was always slightly apart from the group, always watching rather than participating. Even as a young man, he'd had the same isolated expression I'd noticed during his final months. I picked up the photograph of him and Jennifer Walsh, studying their young faces. They looked so hopeful, so in love, completely unaware that their time together was already running out. Jennifer had died never knowing that her daughter was safe and loved. Terrence had lived his entire life wondering if he'd made the right choice in giving me up. The cruelest irony was that they'd both gotten what they wanted most, for me to have a good life, but neither had lived to see it happen. My phone buzzed with a text from Mitchell. Victoria's team filed a motion this afternoon requesting the hearing be postponed. They claim they need more time to review the new evidence. Judge denied it. We proceed as scheduled tomorrow morning. So they were getting desperate. Good. Victoria had spent years controlling and manipulating Terrence, stealing from him while threatening to destroy any chance of a relationship with his daughter. Tomorrow, she would finally face consequences for those choices. I thought about the letter Terrence had hidden, where he'd called me Dad for the first and last time. About how he'd spent his final weeks gathering evidence to protect me from a family that had never wanted me to exist. About Mrs. Chen, who'd found the courage to speak truth despite years of being paid to stay silent. Tomorrow wouldn't just be about inheritance or money. It would be about justice for a man who'd been too afraid to claim his daughter while he was alive, but brave enough to protect her after he was gone. I fell asleep in Terrence's chair, surrounded by the books he'd loved and the photographs that told the story of a life spent searching for connection. When I woke up at dawn, I felt ready to face whatever Victoria threw at us, because I wasn't just Margaret Collins anymore, fighting alone against people with more money and power than I'd ever imagined. I was Terence Hawthorne's daughter, and I'd inherited more than just his fortune. I'd inherited his determination to see justice done, even when it took decades to achieve. The courtroom was packed when Mitchell and I arrived the next morning. Victoria and her brothers sat with their legal team, looking confident and entitled. The media filled the gallery, cameras ready to capture what they expected to be my humiliation. I felt calm for the first time in weeks. Victoria's lawyer spoke first, painting me as a conniving caregiver who'd manipulated a vulnerable elderly man. He questioned the timing of the DNA tests, suggested I'd somehow falsified the results, and portrayed the Hawthorne siblings as devoted family members being cheated out of their rightful inheritance. "Your Honor," he concluded, "this woman preyed on my client's uncle in his weakest moments. She deserves nothing but contempt from this court." When it was Mitchell's turn, he stood slowly and smiled. "Your Honor, everything opposing counsel just said is correct about one thing. Someone did prey on Terence Hawthorne in his final years, but it wasn't my client." He called Mrs. Chen as our first witness. She testified clearly and confidently about overhearing Victoria's threats, about being paid to keep silent, about Victoria's knowledge of my true identity months before Terence's death. So Ms. Pierce knew that Margaret Collins was Mr. Hawthorne's biological daughter, but publicly claimed to be shocked by this revelation? Mitchell asked. "Yes, sir. She knew exactly who Miss Margaret was from the beginning." Next, Mitchell presented the financial documents we'd found in Terence's desk. Bank records showing unauthorized transfers, medical records with Victoria's handwritten notes limiting his care, communications where she'd exceeded her limited power of attorney. The defendants didn't just know about Ms. Collins' true parentage, Mitchell continued. They actively concealed it while systematically stealing from Mr. Hawthorne and controlling his medical treatment. Victoria's face had gone white. Her lawyer was frantically whispering in her ear, but she was staring at the documents like they were poisonous snakes. "Your Honor," Mitchell concluded, "this isn't a case about a gold-digging caregiver. This is a case about financial elder abuse, medical interference, and fraud. My client isn't just Terence Hawthorne's rightful heir. She's the victim of a family conspiracy to keep her from knowing her father." Victoria shot to her feet before her lawyer could stop her. "This is insane! She manipulated him! She's not even really family!" The judge's expression grew stern. "Ms. Pierce, DNA evidence clearly establishes Ms. Collins as Mr. Hawthorne's biological daughter. Your own housekeeper testified that you were aware of this fact months ago. Please explain the discrepancy." Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. "So what if I knew? That woman had no right to waltz into our family and claim what belongs to us. We're the ones who visited him, who took care of his business interests, while stealing from him," the judge interrupted coldly. "The financial records are quite clear on that point." The judge reviewed the evidence for what felt like hours. Finally, he looked up. "I'm not only validating Mr. Hawthorne's will in its entirety," he said, "I'm also ordering a criminal investigation into the defendant's financial activities and potential medical interference. This court finds clear evidence of elder abuse and fraud." As the gavel came down, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Not just the weight of this legal battle, but the weight of a lifetime of wondering who I was and where I came from. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions about my plans for the inheritance, whether I'd press charges against the Hawthorne siblings, what it felt like to go from caregiver to millionaire overnight. "I plan to honor my father's memory," I said simply, "and to use what he left me to help other families find each other the way we did." 6 months later, I established the Jennifer Walsh Foundation, dedicated to reuniting adopted children with their birth families. The Hawthorne Mansion became a retreat center for adoption support groups, Victoria and her brothers were serving time for elder abuse and fraud, and every evening I sit in Terrence's study, my study now, reading the letters he wrote to me over the years, but never sent. Letters full of love and hope, and the kind of dreams that don't die, even when they take over 60 years to come true. I never got to call him Dad while he was alive, but every day I feel him with me, proud of the woman his daughter became, and grateful that love really can find a way, even across decades of separation and walls of secrecy. Sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones we never knew we'd lost until we find them again. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's never too late for a love story to have a happy ending. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.